Today I thought I'd talk about how to develop for mobile apps. We spent most of the series talking about developing web pages with AngularJS and how that made the model view controller architecture easier to use than, say, trying to use simply JavaScript or even JavaScript in jQuery. Now we're going to talk about mobile apps, and this is going to be a bit more of a stretch. AngularJS was not really meant for mobile apps, although it can be used with them. But it turns out the MVC architecture doesn't have anything in particular about it that limits it to the web. And in fact, it shows up in all sorts of places. Its birthplace was not in web apps, and one can imagine that it will be around long after the web is a distant memory, which could be next week with the rate things are changing. MVC works well for the sorts of things that websites do, which is why MVC comes up so much when talking about websites and the overall architecture of the World Wide Web. But now there's a new game in town, mobile apps. We're talking phones and tablets and everything else. And if you look at these sorts of new platforms, you can see a standard laptop on the left and then a tablet in the middle and a phone on the right. You can see that there's a couple things that strike you immediately about them. One is they're smaller. It's much easier to carry a phone than it is to carry your laptop around. Both of them are much easier than to carry a desktop around. They have limited power. You're not going to get a big processor with a giant video card into a flat tablet the way you are some big honking thing that sits next to your desk. And along with the limited power, you're going to get a smaller screen out of it. So there's not going to be as much real estate to show things. In fact, if we look at the important things that the new platforms have in common, one of them is the small screens and limited resources that the form factor brings, and the other is something that you can't see, but is just as important, native app development support. Now, these two features interact to change how content is delivered to mobile devices. It's not your father's web anymore. If you've got a small screen and limited to resources, then you've got the problem that web pages, in general, do not look good and do not work well on mobile devices. They're simply designed to look good and work well on a fairly good sized screen with a fairly powerful processor being able to run all the JavaScript behind the scenes that makes things go. You could always simplify your web page or use a tool and attempt to make sure that your web page will look good on these mobile devices. Problem is that web pages have been getting more and more sophisticated. People have become more and more demanding of the user interface presented to them by web pages to the point where web pages are basically full-blown applications at this point. Now, that makes them larger in terms of size required on the screen to see, code base that's required to support all that functionality, and they're also more difficult to run. The larger your code base gets, the more decisions have to be made, and so on. If you simplify your web page, you make it more responsive on less powerful machines and more readable on smaller screens. Both are things that you're going to get on mobile devices, so that would be a positive. The problem, of course, is that web pages have been getting more sophisticated for a reason. People like them that way. So in some sense, you're going backwards in terms of your web page design and usability in order to make it work on a phone. Not everybody wants to do that. So there have been tools built to make web pages work well on mobile devices. For example, we saw the Ionic framework earlier when we were building our web page to show Google Maps. The Ionic web page, had we shown it on a tablet or a phone, would have done its best to make sure that our web page looked just as good, or at least as good as it could reasonably be made to look, on a phone or a tablet. And there's also Kendo, UI Mobile, React, and a whole bunch of other frameworks to do this sort of thing. Now, the idea behind these platforms is that you would write your code using the platform, and we saw a little bit about that with Ionic. There's some overhead involved in using these frameworks, but then it's the framework's job to make sure that if you're on a tablet or a phone or whatever, it will change the way the user interface looks to optimize itself for that sort of interface. It may have smaller buttons. It may know the difference between being in landscape or portrait mode, those sorts of things. So you pay a little bit of extra effort and time when you write the page in the first place, and then you get this extra functionality at the end. But in either case, your site can become harder to write and maintain because now you're not only using AngularJS and jQuery and JavaScript and whatever else, but you're using this additional framework to make things easier in some sense for you. If that's not working for you, you could try writing a native app. Most mobile platforms provide some way to develop apps that run directly on the system itself. Android Studio, iOS 9 SDK, so on and so forth. These have the advantages of native apps. They take advantage of all the hardware that's available to the application on that particular system, and they look like an application, not a web page. They don't run in a browser, they run full screen inside of your phone. They look like they belong on whatever platform you're developing for. And, not to be underestimated, they become an icon in the user's device. Real estate on these new platforms is a big deal. If you can get an icon on somebody's tablet, that's a permanent advertisement on a device that a person looks at multiple times a day. Sometimes it can be worth it to write a native app, even if all your native app does is basically display your web page, just to get that icon on the user's device. The disadvantage of writing a native app is that often very little carries over from the website. A lot of times you end up just rewriting the whole thing and keeping two development efforts going, one for your website, one for your mobile app. On the plus side of this sort of thing, a good MVC architecture should be able to be ported from web to mobile applications. Maybe not unchanged. After all, you might even be writing in an entirely different language, not JavaScript, but Objective-C or Java perhaps, whatever happens to be used on the mobile device. But what you'll end up with is different implementations of the same underlying model view controller concepts. For example, if you're developing for iOS, you might find that you would end up using subclasses of NSObject for the model, UIView for the view, and UIViewController for the controller. So if you've got a good AngularJS app, you'll know exactly the data that should go into the model, and so you'll be able to take the NSObject object, inherit from it, and put the data that's required into there. You would know the parts of your AngularJS application that controlled the view, and you would find equivalents in the UIView class, and so on. In fact, iOS development in general is very model view controller friendly. Now, you can't say the same thing for Android. This doesn't mean you can't use model view controller on Android, but you're probably going to have to write it yourself. Now, it supports, the normal advanced programming languages in Java and C++ and those sorts of things. So you should be able to use architectures within those languages that help you out with model view controller in order to support it. It's just that Android itself is not going to be as handy with it as iOS is. Now, Windows Mobile supports a close relative, the model view model pattern, where you have SQLite database for the model, the observable collection object or class for the view model, and user control for the view. And so you could find a reasonable way to transform your model view controller architecture into a Windows mobile app. Now, maybe someday soon, JavaScript will run on native apps. For example, if you could get Node.js ported over to iOS, then you would be able to run your JavaScript directly there, and JavaScript would run as if it were native. And then you could take all your hard-earned AngularJS knowledge and you could build native apps on these different platforms. In summary then, developing for mobile sites is different. There are tools that will help with cross-platform development. They're nice in the sense that you can maintain a single development stream. They impose a little overhead in that you have to learn an additional framework in order to use them, but they do a pretty decent job of making sure that your stuff will look as good on a mobile device as it does on the web. Now, if you decide to write a native app instead, you can end up throwing a whole lot out. But a good model view controller architecture can provide a unifying structure that both the website and the mobile app can share, thereby sparing you a lot of extra work when it comes time to converting from one to the other.